Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great.
And really appreciate your efforts to organize this and bringing art into town.
My pleasure. So I am Joy Buolamwini. I'm a board certified internist. I've also, along with Sunil, been involved with Health Technet for probably 30 years, although we'll both deny that. I'm going to introduce myself and Art will be on camera for his introduction, and then we'll switch to the slides, the PowerPoint. I have been a huge fan of Art Kleiner for a while. I'll leave it at that. Art has been editor for Strategy+Business, which just provided incredible insights. I think the personal story is that I, along with several of the people who joined us today, who were former ex-Oracle Cerner people, David, John, I'm probably blanking on others, and then the new Oracle person, Sandy. One of the things that was my introduction at Cerner was the issue of culture and how important that was, and it was very important to the growth of Cerner, and it was a very, very helpful thing. And I think one of the things that Art said that was just kind of blew me away a few years ago was that Art noticed that with every new technology or innovation, there often was a new business model that evolved to serve it effectively. And behind that, there was a culture that was that characterized it, that was important to be understood. And for me, the thing that really brought that all together was one of Art's earlier books called Who Really Matters, which is on core group theory. And so I highly recommend that. When I saw that Art had a book coming out on artificial intelligence, I immediately started sending him emails with questions, and he was kind enough to give me a lot of energy. Art is a cultural historian of business technology. He's an advisor to decision makers on the future of artificial intelligence. He's a catalytic ghost writer, so the concept of ghosts are a recurring theme here. And he's an editorial consultant. Probably his best known editorial consultant work is he worked with Peter Senge on The Fifth Discipline and several of the volumes that came out of that. So Art has been helping a lot of people get their ideas out for a long time. And so with that, I'd like to let Art introduce himself on camera, and then we'll bring his slides up.
It's just so, thank you. It's so great to be in this group of people who really are working with healthcare and the tremendous challenging issues.
Give me a little louder.
Healthcare and the tremendous challenge. I'm going to start over. It's so great to be among a group of people who are working with the tremendous challenges facing healthcare, and particularly in the information sphere. And my impression is that AI has both helped provide ways to deal with those challenges, but also amplified and automated the things that make them challenging in the first place. So there, and that probably takes us right to the subject of this talk, which is the AI dilemma. I'm going to, just before we start, I'm also going to say that, the instigator of the book, my co-author, Juliette Powell, I just want to mention her as, kind of the person who taught me a lot of what I'm about to talk about here. And when we developed the book, we were aware that we were at a pivotal moment. That was before ChatGPT was announced. So that came out just as we were, that was released just as we were in our copy edit stage. And we, of course, rewrote the entire book as a result. And everything that's happened since then makes me more and more aware that the big issues with technology are not the technology issues. They're the human behavior and organizational issues that underlie the technology. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And then towards the end, we're going to bring it back for our discussion to the areas involving healthcare and life sciences, where you're all involved. Okay, Joe, if you don't mind. First Okay, so,
If you'd like to sit down, Art, we can probably focus the camera.
no, this is
that-
better. This is better.
You'd rather stand?
Yeah,
Okay.
and it'll look better as well, but I'm
Great.
happy this way.
You look great.
Yeah. And if you're not, just a couple of technical things. If you're not presenting, please put yourself on mute. And let's go. So the next slide, if you will. Okay, the AI dilemma is really simple. The technology in the wrong hands is dangerous, and in the right hands, it's beneficial to everyone, and they're the same hands. How many people here are parents? Okay, so everybody, and I assume the same is probably true online. And maybe your experience is like mine. I have 3 daughters. They're in their 20s now. But when they were infants, when my oldest was an infant, I thought, I've got this. Sleeping. I know everything I need to know. And then she got older. And her sisters came along. And I realized just how much I needed to learn in order to make this work and how long that learning was going to take. So here we are. That's where humanity is right now with artificial intelligence. If you don't mind going to the next slide. Before we go any further, I'm just going to say, I'm going to use the word artificial intelligence because it's what people say. But by it, I really mean what most people in the field call machine learning. We're talking about systems that are autonomous. They act without real-time guidance. They're adaptive in that they change based on what they experience. And they're algorithmic. They're built through models, data, and software code. Technically speaking, that's not really intelligence. We're not going to get into the debate about whether they're really cognitive or not, or how soon that's going to come. But for now, I'm mostly talking about systems involving machine learning. And the next slide, if you will, John. So we are now, humanity's at the kind of place now where I was as a parent. It was so small and quiet, and now it's growing really, really fast. And it's getting into all kinds of trouble, and we're going to be responsible. And the decisions that we collectively make about how to organize and use and develop these tools are going to affect the way things turn out for decades, probably. We're at that kind of pivotal moment. So, next slide, if you will. And we're starting to see this awareness move into public view. I think AI, in a way, is a forcing function in that it's creating an atmosphere where decision makers have to pay attention explicitly to things that were implicit before. So you see, for instance, leaders in the field saying, we need to put research on hold for 6 months until we figure it out. They didn't, but they achieved their goal of bringing the issues of AI responsibility to broader and broader awareness. It can't be ignored anymore. Next slide. This year, we've seen that deep fake images, deep fake information, hallucinations as they call them, are going to be everywhere. And it's kind of buyer beware in terms of how you make sense of it. Next slide. We've seen that intellectual property can no longer be taken for granted. It can be brought in and used as data, not just, artistic work, but personal data of all sorts. We've seen the number of issues and controversies that come to public attention rise, not exponentially, but pretty strongly linearly, and they will probably continue to rise. Many of them are here just coming to public attention. They were always there, but now people are more aware of it. And we're seeing a lot of experiments with self-driving cars now moving into the actual sphere. Here is one of the robo-taxis that's available if you want to hail a cab in San Francisco. So let's do another kind of quick show of hands. How long, so I'm going to ask it 4 times, multiple choice. How long do you think it's going to take your community, whether it's Tyson's Corners or DC or somewhere else, your town, to follow San Francisco's example and approve self-driving cabs? I just want to get a sense of people's sense of the future. Okay. Next year or the year after, 2024, 2025, how many people think?
Looks like 0 or 1, sorry. Yeah.
Where do you live?
I'm in Fairfax, Virginia.
So, okay. 2025, 2027, maybe about 3 years, 3 to 5 years from now.
Probably. I live in Great Falls, Virginia, and that's a fairly rural area. And I could imagine, automated self-driving cars being safer in an environment like that, trees. But presumably they can, but in downtown DC, it's a very different story, as San Francisco has found out.
Yeah.
So I guess it depends on the type of community.
San Francisco hasn't given up on it yet.
Uh-huh.
And in rural areas, it's harder to get a cab. So self-driving cars may fill a real need. 2028 to 2030, so, 7 years. So the rest of you think it's going to be after 2030. It's going to take 7, 8 years or more, 10 years before we get self-driving cars. My sense is that people inside the tech field think it's much shorter. And, of course, we don't know. In scenario work, this would be an uncertainty. Will there be robo-taxis at some point, within the lifetime of many people, who might think about this?
Yeah, it all depends on the infrastructure by the government. So, even if we think technology, it can happen next week, but the country must have a new infrastructure to avoid the incidents that happen in San Francisco. So it is not just the technology.
No, and
The government cannot even reach who is the majority leader. So I don't think it's going to happen.
Well, the government doing the infrastructure is not necessarily the same one choosing the majority leader, but
I'm just joking.
and other.
We use Ubers all the time, and the variability of an Uber driver and the Uber vehicle is right. So to have something that is standard, you call it, the passenger probably will have some control over some aspects of it, but it would just be nice to be standardized again.
Well, one thing we can probably say for sure is that as self-driving cars become more common, human behavior will change. It always does to match technology. So for instance, there may be clothing that people wear because it's tagged to some way of being recognized as a person by an automated system. And there will probably be, yes, new forms of highway design, new forms of infrastructure, but also new forms of behavior so that we may get used to cueing the machines around us, not just cars, but every type of AI, in the same way that right now we're used to scrolling when we want to see something on a website. Okay.
I'd like to follow up. There's an interesting thing about the infrastructure. Part of this, I think, is really important. In a funny way, I was in Paris a couple of weeks ago. I hadn't been there in a number of years. And there's been a transformation in the way the traffic works in the city. There are bikes and motorbikes like you can't believe.
Yeah.
And it's because and the cars go nowhere because they've taken a full lane out of every major road and made it. And so suddenly there were always bikes around, but it was kind of like in DC. But you see, when there was a change in that infrastructure, the number of bicycles and motorcycles just blew up exponentially in just a couple of years. But I think that's critical for the self-driving car thing too. We have to figure out how to create the safe space for these things to operate. And as soon as that happens, then the technology is a no-brainer.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I just got back from a 2-week trip with my wife to Scotland and other parts of the UK, mostly in Scotland. And I was impressed by a couple of things. One is how courteous everyone is to each other, to visitors. It's just their culture is courtesy. And that's true on the roads. Can't think of one time. And we were driving around an awful lot seeing the countryside with a guide, and he never saw anybody tailgating anybody. There was one person from another country who did some dangerous things passing, which was even more unnerving because, of course, you're on the opposite side of the road. So that was part of it. And I think that the traffic situation there is just much better because people have learned to live with crowded conditions, and they let each other in, and they realize maybe they're not in not as much of a hurry. The other thing was how advanced the UK is with technology. You don't need money. You just tap your card everywhere. And it doesn't often get held up by tipping. They don't mind tips, but they really don't expect them. They'd rather you just tap the card and move on. So transactionally, it really works quite well, and very different from the US.
We've got a question. Sandy, did you want to come off mute?
Yeah, so what I wanted to say is that it all has to do with different risk thresholds. And so that is a cultural difference that will be different from San Francisco and California to Maryland to Virginia to local towns in Vermont. It's all going to be somewhat different. But then it comes down to the hard aspects of legislation. And you're probably going to tell us, Vernon, a lot more about what you know about our legislators who understand the technology or don't, and they have to come up to speed and they have to write legislation, and that's a long process. That has to become regulations, and that's a long process. And then the regulations have to become policies which are implemented. So when I chose a longer timeline, it wasn't because of technology capabilities. It was about the culture and the actual practical aspects of legislating that gets down to policies that can be implemented. Over.
Right there. So let me go through a little bit of this. As I'm hearing, one of the things I'm hearing is the discussion is going to be really interesting, but let me give you a few things, including some of the things coming up, not so much in the United States on legislation, but in the European Union where things are moving a little faster. But let's start here. Are you familiar with the Moral Machine project at MIT's Media Lab? Okay, you know about the trolley problem, right? You know, you've got two terrible decisions. Somebody's going to live, somebody's going to die. You have no time to decide, and you have to choose. Well, a group of researchers at MIT's Media Lab put that into an online exercise. It looked like this. And they asked people who signed in to say, okay, you're not making the decision, but you're programming a self-driving car. And that's going to make the decision. So you have to give it rules in advance. And the car is going to either hit, okay.
Oops.
Yeah, maybe if we're going to hold, let's hold questions and I'll try to move this smoothly along.
Yeah, if we could hold questions until the end for a few minutes, that'd be great.
Okay, so Joe, I'm going to ask you to, okay, next slide. And I'm going to give you cues pretty quickly.
Good.
So imagine you're programming a self-driving car. It's running down, the brakes fail, and it's got to go one lane or the other lane. It's either going to hit a pregnant woman or a dog. It's either going to hit a person crossing at the green or a jaywalker crossing at the red. It's either going to hit a younger family with children or it's going to hit a group of senior citizens. It's either going to hit women or it's going to hit men. It's either going to hit an athletic person or a sedentary person. What do you choose? What do you tell it? They asked, as you no, just go back to that slide, the map slide. They asked about 40 million, well, they asked millions of people. They got about 40 million decisions because each round is about 13 decisions, 10 languages, 233 countries. And you know what they reached consensus on? Just 3 things. Most people will save lives. They will, you know, they'll hit 2 people instead of 5 people. Most people will favor saving humans over pets. except for my daughters. And most people will favor saving children over adults. And that was it. Older versus younger, some cultures favor older people. Some cultures feel like they want to save, young adults. Some cultures favor the jaywalker. Some cultures favor the person who crosses lawfully. Every person is different. Every culture is different. And we are sitting here thinking there will be universal rules of values. And there is no real universal agreement about most values. And in that context, humanity, is trying to say, how do we raise this child so that it is beneficial to humanity and so that it doesn't do unintentional harm. Juliette Powell and I, most of our research was oriented towards finding out how people in the field had thought about these issues and converging them and turning them into or expressing them as principles. And we ended up with 7. And I'm going to run through them now and run through a bit of the ramifications of them. And all of them are, we deliberately did not use the metaphor of the Hippocratic Oath because software engineers are not like really engineers. They're not certified as engineers, and their job does not really involve being held responsible in that way. But we did feel that these were universal principles in the sense that they pop up wherever the technology is seriously considered, and they are going to be especially important as organizations are held accountable for the way the consequences of these automated systems play out. So, next slide, if you will. Okay, actually, one of the issues here is the relevance of this to the medical field, and just 2 things to point out. This is machine learning in medical research, and it was done by counting peer-reviewed papers, and it stops in 2020, so it's only gone exponentially up since then. Second slide. This is what we tend to be talking about when we talk about machine learning in a health or life sciences environment. This slide comes from medical imaging, but the process is fairly consistent. It's, first you work on data quality and quantity. Where you're getting the data from and how good is it, how representative is it, and how much bias is inherent in it. Then you work on how the data is tagged because someone or some entity has to parse each piece of data and assign it 1 or more tags to that will guide the system in processing it and drawing patterns from it. Eventually, it can do that for itself, but it needs, enough of the data has to be tagged enough of the time that it can make sense of it. Then you have to think about the algorithm. You have to have an algorithm that is, accountable and can be observed and can be understood and that is effective in its logic. And then finally, that last one is the people who use and work on the system have to be attuned to the potential consequences, the way in which it's going to be used, and to the decisions that they make and the way that they have to be conscious of how their use of AI influences the decisions they make. So this learning process is taking place now in many places where AI is being introduced. The 7 principles that we have. Okay, the first one was be intentional about risk to humans. We originally phrased this as do no harm, but risk is inevitable. There's always risk in anything to do with this technology, and so you have to be intentional about it. And you have to know where to introduce the human point of view versus letting the technology run on its own. This man is a hero of the Cold War. He was in the Soviet military. He was responsible for looking at missiles coming into the Soviet Union. One day in 1983, he saw the warning signal, which was satellite-based, saw 5 missiles coming in towards St. Petersburg, and he had a hunch that this was a glitch in the system and not actual missiles. And instead of reporting that there were 5 missiles coming in, he reported up that there was a glitch in the system and it had perceived 5 missiles. And the Soviet Union did not retaliate, even though this was a tense moment in international relations. And here we are. We're still here. That type of response, when we learned that story, Juliette, well, I said to Juliette, look, no government is going to put automated systems in charge of nuclear weapons at this scale without a human being in the loop. And then we started asking around in nuclear physics circles. And we've learned that a number of people in nuclear weapons research and nuclear physics are very concerned about that. So if you will, next slide. This is from Marco Sebols at Columbia University. Turns out that countries some of them see automated systems and the speed with which they make decisions as competitive advantage, as an advantage in if they need it. And so he said, in a changing, chaotic, and globally competitive world, AI automated weapons of mass destruction are a terribly scary eventuality. It's not whether they'll be used in military uses, but how they'll be used and when they'll be used and in what circumstances. Okay, so be intentional about risk. The European Union AI Act, we mentioned regulation. Of the various efforts around regulation, this is probably the one that's going to come first, and it's going to set a tone for the others. And the European Union AI Act does a few things in its current form. It says there it's going to be signed into law in 2023, probably more like next year, but the momentum on it is moving forward. It holds accountable any firm or any company that produces or uses AI that draws on data that was gathered in the European Union countries. So you could be doing business with, authoritarian countries on one hand and other countries, democratic countries on another hand, and using completely different systems. But if you're breaking these guidelines, they're going to hold you responsible regardless of where it is in the world if you gather data in the European Union. Under the grounds that data gathered in the European Union is being used for these purposes, and therefore they have jurisdiction. They break all categories of AI, all examples of AI into 4 categories. Minimal risk are, operations in factories and spam filters, children's games, things that clearly would have no harm for human beings. Limited risk systems are systems we converse with, online therapists and online friends, as long as they are clear that they're software and not people. If they pretend to be people, then they're unacceptable. High-risk systems are self-driving cars. Most or all of in-depth medical research. Anything to do with predictive analytics. Things where the unintended, the benefits are immense, but the unintended consequences could be really difficult. And those will be audited, like publicly held companies are audited now by financial auditors. The EU is proposing putting in place a system of tech auditors. I don't think anybody has done that before. And I don't think the tech industry is ready for it. And that is, the discussions on that and the issues around that and the implementation of it are a big change. And then finally, systems that, facial recognition systems, biometric recognition systems that classify people according to what ethnic group or other type of group they belong to. Those are going to be deemed unacceptable and they're going to be banned. And banning, and they could be fined if they're used despite the ban, and the fines can be up to 6% of a company's annual global revenues. So it's a significant fine. And those are, there have been bans on technology before, but not of sort of pure computer technology, digital technology. And Italy banned ChatGPT and generative AI, and the ban lasted about a month. So this too is a really interesting conversation that's coming up. Next slide. Okay, the next one, our second principle is open the closed box, explainable AI, transparency. It's really hard to get a machine learning system to tell you the logic that it uses because they don't operate in logic the same way that we do. So for example, an AI system being an image creating system that's supposed to give you a picture of a cat, it will learn about cats by looking at pictures of cats that are tagged cat. And then next slide. It will then, when it's time to reproduce a cat, when you ask it for a picture of a cat, it will take random pixels and iterate really rapidly until it gets closer and closer to the images of what a cat looks like. And then when it finally gets close enough, it will give you that image, which is why the pictures look a little strange. They're beautiful, but they're not really based on a theory of this is a cat and why it's a cat. If a system, accuses you of fraud, says you're statistically likely to commit fraud, it can't tell you why. It doesn't have a theory of fraud. It just knows that you're closer to the images, the verbal or conceptual images of fraud that it has learned through accessing the data. There are a lot of efforts to solve this and work this, but
Questions at the end?
questions at the end, yeah. And I know I can be challenged on this,
No challenge, just a question.
but it's those efforts are still works in progress. Next slide. Our third principle is confront and question bias. This is from Joy Buolamwini's really influential paper, also at the MIT Media Lab, called Gender Shades. And those figures, she took three, and her team took three different efforts, three different software packages that were gender classifiers. They were supposed to look at an image and say whether it's male or female. And the accuracy rate on their evaluations was close to 100% for the lighter skinned males. For the darker skinned males and the lighter skinned females, it was around 90%, sometimes more. And for the darker skinned females, they got a third of them wrong. One of them got 80% right, got only a fifth of them wrong. The issue is not in the algorithm, it's in the collection of data that was gathered. The collection and decision about whose images are available online has inherent bias that is built into the way people think about other people. And AI brings that to our attention in a way that may not have been obvious before once we start looking. And there are, a lot, I don't have any idea of percentages, but there are a huge number of AI systems that are used for decision making that have bias in them so deeply embedded that we don't see. Next slide. Fourth principle is reclaim data rights for people. I bought an Apple computer today. Joe and I were at the Apple store. He was accompanying me and we bought it, and I logged in and I clicked OK when it said, do you want to join iTunes or iCloud? And as I did that, I gave permission. That is a map of the data that Apple now has the right to collect about me. My personal data, my address, my name, not my social security number, but my credit card numbers, my purchasing history, my browsing history, all of that Each strand is a separate piece of data. And one of the most interesting things going on right now is the question of what kinds of systems would allow people to have control over their personal data, to decide how it's going to be used, who's going to be using it, and where. And maybe they could get paid for it. And that is where a lot of regulation is probably going to go. That hasn't gotten there yet. Next slide. Okay, this is a picture of Mark Rutte. He was the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, and he left, he resigned after a scandal came to light. It was a predictive analytics scandal in the around 2007. Netherlands put in place a child welfare fraud detection scheme, and it singled out and accused 26,000 people of being likely to commit welfare fraud, and it asked them to return the money that they had been given, and it was biased. It favored people who were single income families, people where one of the parents worked 2 jobs, and people who had immigrated from Turkey and Morocco. 26,000 people, some went to jail, many lost their homes, many went bankrupt. 1,500 children were forcibly separated from their parents. Some of their accountants went to jail. And the point about accountability is that it took 7 years for the scandal even to come to light, because it was happening. Nobody knew, suddenly I'm being told I'm committing welfare fraud and I have to, justify it. But I don't know that there's thousands of other people until it gradually, people started checking notes and it became more and more apparent. And it's now 13 years later, and the families have, it's been agreed that the families need to be, have money, they need restitution. But it hasn't happened yet still, because now there's debate over how the restitution should take place. And this is the Netherlands. This is one of the most enlightened countries. I love the Netherlands. This is one of the most enlightened countries that there is in many ways. And this kind of thing, we had lots of stories we could have chosen to talk about. But the point is that without accountability, these things happen. Again, something that, the medical professions wrestle with constantly. And exactly what the right form of that is, again, a work in progress. Next slide. We can skip that slide. What organizations are good for developing complex systems like AI? This is Charles Perrow, who studied nuclear power plant disasters and other complex disasters. Turns out when you have a really close-knit executive team that all work together, engineers and technicians working with the decision makers, and they all have the same idea about the way things work, and they're all in the same loop, you get this. Next slide. The better way is with a loosely coupled organization where decision makers are not necessarily all from the same place, where the processes are more widespread, where there's more opportunities for checks and balances, as they say, and where the dominoes, if one domino falls technically or organizationally, the others don't automatically fall with it. Setting that up and making that happen is partly a matter of the organization's structure, and a lot of it is a matter of the organization's culture, which, I come from a background of organizational learning, and in the advisory work we do, we're dealing with the tech issues, but a lot of what we're dealing with is the organizational issues as well. Final principle is embrace creative friction. This is a book on user interface. It's one of the most popular books on user interface design. And you can see from the title, the goal here is frictionlessness. I want it to tell me what I want to do. I want to get there. I don't want to think about it. And that's how we expect automated systems to work. It turns out that they don't work as well. And a lot of research, next slide, is shows that organizations where diverse groups of people can work together and come to decisions together, even though they have different backgrounds, those tend to be more profitable and more successful by any metric. Years ago, I did scenario work with a group of nurses in South Dakota, nursing educators. And one of the things that became clear is that they did not have a lot of creative friction when people actually went to work in the medical facilities. It's not so much that there was a pecking order as it was very hard for all but a few people to ask questions and to raise issues. And that turns out to not be a successful way to run an organization, especially when AI is involved. Next slide. So in the book and in reality, we found that there are 4 groups of people who really have influence over the way that AI plays out. And they all have a different cultural background. They all have different priorities, different ways of looking at things. There are engineers who are interested in the quality of the code, but see, the responsibility side as, somebody else is more expert than I at that, so we should give that to the experts. There's the business logic where, our organization has a purpose, it's a commercial purpose. We won't succeed, we won't be able to continue unless we fulfill that, that business purpose. I know there's a lot of entrepreneurs in this group, so you know that very well. I'm an entrepreneur myself. I honor and respect that, but it's very tough when it comes to externalities because we don't have time for that. And maybe they're going to get in our way. There's the government logic, which, we started to talk about, in which accountability is a big issue. And, there need to be people to watch the robots. There need to be robots to watch the robots. But who watches the watch robots? And then there's social justice. The social justice activists have proven to be surprisingly influential in raising these issues, which is important, and need to learn more. Well, actually, all 4 of these groups need to understand each other, need to engage with each other. Part of creative friction is bringing these groups together in a constructive way, which allows for the huge benefits, productivity, profitability, reach, range, solving incredibly complex problems that can't be solved otherwise, that allow that to go forward while still being the same hands that now are more aware or driven by more awareness of how to prevent harm. Okay, we're almost done. It occurred to me, and Joe sort of checked this out a bit too, that, there are 4 such groups in the healthcare and life sciences communities. And this may, in fact, be a part of the business and public interest world that could take a lead in getting some of these things to happen. Some of these creative friction attitudes and approaches to happen. I won't dwell on it because you know so much more about it than I do, which the cracks in the foundations of U.S. healthcare. This is a slide that is based on the basically a dialogue that Joe showed me that covers areas of concern, and AI plays a role in all of these, either a helping role or a exacerbating the problem role.
Art, since it's kind of a small type, would you be able to rattle off a few of them, what the cracks are?
Do you have that at your fingertips, Joe?
Yeah. So, the first one is inequity, and so we all know that healthcare is not accessible by all, and people don't get consistently the best evidence-based medicine. So that's a social justice logic of power issue. And then you'll all have access to the slides. There's a description in the second column that defines first, in this case, growing health inequity through the generations of broken institutional trust. And then the technologies that can address this that are in the space of artificial intelligence and machine learning is verifiable credentials, zero knowledge proofs, causal inference, and a lot of these things you really have to look at collectively because they get at the issue of how we consent information, how we do learning, et cetera. So I'll leave this.
If maybe just the left-hand column, since we are going to be seeing this later.
So
like inequity, what's the second one?
Incentives. So this is the cracks in the healthcare base. Consent. So right now, we have irrevocable blanket consents to access information. The fourth one is privacy, accelerating privacy risk and increasing risks from breaches. So whenever you put all the data in a central repository, you've got what's called a honeypot. And we all know that the breaches that are happening in healthcare, like Leo, you did a presentation on this recently, they're just, they're more frequent and they're larger. Security, so pervasively compromised data security and centralization. Centralization works really well if you are have a market monopoly on either, for example, selling advertising, which would be Google, or Amazon and selling products, or provider organizations that don't want your records to be readily available by others, including potentially you. Trust in AI, significant and apparently intractable trust. Fragmentation, we have highly fragmented identification systems and identifiers. Data integrity, questionable data integrity, low computational trust. See a bunch of heads nodding as I'm reading these out in the room. The ninth one is waste, fraud, and abuse in gaps between stakeholder systems. And the last one is data trade, ethically questionable, decreasing legal trade in de-identified data.
So if you don't mind going to the next slide, this is great. Joe, thank you for, and the next one. Okay, after hearing a list like that, we're kind of seeing just how broad the number of issues are. And many of them don't come to light until push comes to shove. And then we need to deal with them. And then it's sort of like everything else going on now in the internet. There's so much of it, and it's so hard to know where to turn for quality and where to turn for the correct solutions. So part of our job now together is framing the priorities. Part of our job now together is recognizing how to be accountable for these things without going over the, without basically getting overwhelmed, and how to use the tools in a way that accentuates value for people. So, it is like a wartime responsibility. So we put the quote here from Winston Churchill: "Price of greatness is responsibility." Some civilizations, aspire to greatness, some stumble into it, and we seem to have had greatness thrust upon us, or at least I hope so. Thank you. Question?
Excellent. Joe, you want to lead question and answer?
Sure. Wondering
I think Mohit.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. No. Actually, I want to make one comment as taking my. The only thing that I've seen that's slightly beyond where you got today with the nature of machine learning and deep learning is self-supervised learning. So you don't have to actually have tagged information. The work going on in that space, especially with digital pathology, is truly mind-blowing. And so the technology is just increasingly putting me in awe of things that it can do that I didn't appreciate it was going to be able to do.
Yeah, I should have been more explicit about that. But yeah, it's...
Yeah, Mo, you...
I just have quick comments. There's no challenges here, just comments, all right? And the first one is when you were talking at the early
I think we have
I just wanted to, great, principles back up there. Do you have like one slide? with all seven,
I
or-
don't have a slide handy with all 7 of them.
Okay, all right.
I need one, but yeah.
So my question for you, great presentation, by the way, thank you for that. From a healthcare perspective, you said, Leon, like AI can be dangerous if in the wrong hands. So just to give you some perspective from the federal government, because I work for the federal government, I was in one of the conferences recently, like 2 weeks ago, which is Society to Improve Diagnosis in Medicine. And last year when I was there, AI was hardly mentioned. This year it was one of the biggest topics everywhere. So I just wanted to, like, I work in the patient safety work within the federal government. Where do you see that it could potentially cause like patient safety or other concerns just within healthcare?
I think that's a question for the group. Obviously this presentation was prepared for a much more general audience.
Okay.
I put those 2 slides of healthcare because I was looking for something that would ground what we're doing. And so anything I say would be like a journalist level kind of thing. And let me ask, actually, most of what I would think of would be in the order of mistakes. Some of it, might be in the order of, well, I'm just going to leave it at that. But is it reasonable to think that there is danger in this field, that, from the use of AI systems? Is it something that occurs to you as you think about this?
So much of healthcare involves judgment, right? And so you can surface a problem or potential mistake, but then somebody has to judge whether it's a mistake. Now, whether they judge it, I do a lot of medical legal stuff, whether they judge it correctly or not is then held to court of public opinion, right? And so on either side, there would be a potential of the decision was right. And I would hate to have a machine determining who is right, right? So I think that is a potential danger.
So you said medical legal perspective, let's just say that the AI provides some differential diagnosis or some like, okay, this is probably the diagnosis, and the human acts upon that recommendation.
Right.
Going back to the human, right? Because ultimately, it's the human that is responsible for choosing going by the recommendation.
I think we would have to ensure that the algorithms would not determine the rightness of the decision, right? In so much of medical legal cases, you look at it and you think, okay, well, this person was thinking this way. They took the facts as they were and they made the judgment. And yet the lawyer or the opposing side is saying, well, wait, their decision was wrong, right? So I think it would be important that we sort of lay the ground rules before we introduce a machine into the decision making.
Well, there's an FDA standard as well that applies to that. In other words, if my understanding is that, and I'm not an FDA lawyer, but I've been involved with certain companies that had to decide whether they needed FDA approval. Apache Medical Systems, if you remember, that became a part of Cerner. Joe, you may remember the acquisition, but essentially it was developed at George Washington University, and it gathered data on critical care patients and had predictions as to what their survivability rate would be, depending upon the symptoms and the types of medications that were given and other forms of treatment. They could display that, and people who were in critical care situations, the physicians could look at that data and say, okay, the survivability quotient is this under these similar circumstances. But if that system were designed, and it was not, to actually make the decision, then it would have to get FDA approval. And in the case of Apache, it didn't do that, and it was determined they didn't need FDA approval. that kind of illustrates the line you were, I think, referring to. Human judgment has to be part of this, the ultimate decision.
Right.
Or you've got a big problem. And in fact, Jim Oakes, who's on the phone now, told me about an article in the Wall Street Journal a ways back where certain nurses, I can't remember the hospital, might have been St. Joseph's, were told that they had to follow certain standards that were developed by artificial intelligence. And they refused to do that. They said, no, we need to make our own human judgment. And some of them were fired as a result of it because the hospital was looking at it as protocols that had to be followed. And the nurses said, no, I don't think that would have produced the right outcome.
Actually, let me follow. Go ahead.
This is Jim. I just wanted to emphasize that point that, and it kind of relates back to one of your earlier slides when you said that the more people understood technology or the more they understood the issue, the more likely they were to predict that self-driving cars would be ubiquitous or in their neighborhood earlier. I'm kind of going in the opposite direction, and I feel like the more I'm learning about the status of this, the more skeptical I'm becoming of its ability to really take things over. And David just put a really good example on the table that it's you made the point that it can be used for good or bad, and I can't remember exactly the words you used, but in this case, it was clearly to me a case of people who didn't really understand what the technology was doing, relying on it too heavily by requiring staff to follow its recommendations.
And we see that. Two examples came to mind as you were talking. One is, opinions or the consensus about what constitutes effective treatment changes, especially in a fast-moving situation like a public health crisis. And AI locks a form of activity. It locks a set of guidelines into place. And it may be harder to change them when they're automated and spread out everywhere and scaled. On the other hand, it may be easier to change them because they're spread out everywhere and scaled. And so changing all those guideline books may be now just a matter of asking, ChatGPT to do it, to change it everywhere. But somebody has to have the sense of where the scaling takes place. And, again, we have to be then aware, we have to be intentional about what we put forth and how it might be changed and under what circumstances. We can't delegate that to the AI. And that was one. And then the other one is how many medical personnel, physicians, nurses, advisors to patients are going to use ChatGPT to write out their instructions or something like it. And what kind of oversight will there be to ensure that the descriptions of what someone should do? Because now you can delegate to the patient, right, or to the individual more of the treatment because you can articulate what the process should be, what you should do every day. And AI makes it much easier to write out those instructions and those guidelines.
Okay, so Mayo, I believe, just put out a study, I saw it just like a week or two ago, comparing for different kinds of surgeries, I think it was dermatology, a note that was just written up by a doc, which took about 7 or 8 minutes, versus a doc gave a little 3 sentences, create a note that would encompass A, B, and C. The doc spoke for about 10 or 15 seconds, and out came the note. And the notes were validated by the docs being really good notes. So it was right.
And as long as the doc is validating.
Yeah.
But what about the cases where the doc says, actually, it should be a little bit different? How big is the temptation to let the AI, you've validated 100, and are you going to let the next 30 go?
I think it's same thing with like the EHR templates. I mean, often the people are, they get the template, and that beats 2 hours a night, 5 days a week. The docs are spending on putting in clinical documentations.
Tools are going to be great, but
Yeah, you said something in the beginning that was very fascinating. Made the point about that the AI engines don't tell you what they're doing. And this is an intriguing difference between everything that we have heretofore understood about computing, which is that computer systems, no matter how many lines of code and how many, how fast they can go, they're deterministic. You can find the logic. It is fixed. So we're now talking about things that define their own logic. And this, I think, is to me, is one of the scarier challenges, to be able to, everything we know about managing computer systems and securing them and all of that stuff is built around these, if you will, deterministic principles. And now there's something different, completely different in the mix. So that thing that I was also wondering about, how are the Europeans looking at this as they're thinking through the question of validating and auditing such systems? Are they thinking of an ISO standard that could be used? I know NIST has got guidance, but I went and read it, and it's real NIST. It's like, hey, this stuff's tricky. Figure it out. But there, how is this inherent newness of problem being addressed by people who are like, are we taking an old approach to a new thing? Or what's going on at that level, if you have any insight?
Well, I think there's awareness that the old approach won't work with the new thing, right? The old regulations are kind of, as you said, do the best you can with these rules. I think there are people who are working on the practice of AI auditing. We talked to several of them as we were putting the book together. One group called For Humanity is running a course on AI auditing that is for people who expect to be prepared for when the AI Act becomes law. And the practice is looking at outcomes. A lot of the practice is looking at outcomes. And then going back not to the program, but to the organization that did the program. How did you decide what data to pull? How did you decide what boundaries to draw? How did you know the data was representative and high quality? How then did you set up the algorithm so that it would create? What model did you use in setting up the algorithm? Why did you choose that model? Why did you then go on to apply this model to this particular problem, and in what way? Now, you ask that of a private company, and it's like you're asking for their trade secrets. So that's one of the challenges right now, is what do we do with innovation when the innovation also has to be accountable?
I mean, I can share a little bit about sort of how we're doing it in practice, right? So, I mean, if you think about the question of bias, you can come into an algorithm across the complete life cycle, from how you frame the question or the data you're collecting, the actual algorithm design itself. And then once it's released in the wild, a variety of things can happen with the model, whether it stays accurate or it drifts away. So across each of these stages, there's a variety of like heuristics and information you can provide that provides a decision maker with knowledge and insights to whether they're doing this in a fair way. Now, so one of those tools, we have a decision tree for guiding which fairness metrics to choose, because certain things, to your point earlier, are less risky or more risky or others, or it's better to not leave anybody out, or it's better to make sure you choose the right people. So based upon those decision trees of which fairness metrics to use will guide which of those metrics. And then you have dashboards that can actually show you those metrics for the specific model at hand, right? And then as you get those metrics, you can identify specific areas of bias, say in the data, then you can apply bias mitigation techniques, right? Either you oversample here, or you change how data is weighted in the model in a variety of ways. But I think at the core of that is, there's some of the points earlier, is like, just make sure you're able to explain that fully. I mean, at the end of the day, in many of these models, I mean, it's weights and probabilities and being combined in different ways, and it's hard to see those, especially like in large language models. But for other machine learning models, it's still, you can explain those with being able to show that. And I think the other sort of key consideration is for folks who are releasing these models is just making it sure you have a way to actively monitor them over time, right? And if there is a change in the model performance, then set up an alert, right? And so somebody, a human gets an alert says, hey, your model has not performing as it was when it was initially released. And so maybe that also triggers that it's not being used in a certain context until that's being ameliorated, for example.
So the foreword to your book was done by Esther Dyson. And one of the points that she made, and I thought was an optimistic point, I'd like to get your take if I read it correctly, what you're thinking is that part of the value of AI is that it help us make explicit the modeling that we're using in society so that we can actually be making better decisions in a intentional fashion. Was that the point that she was making?
It's one of them. She also says insurance companies are going to step into the forefront of this because they're at risk. Let me ask your name. I can't quite see your name.
It's Kenyon.
Kenyon. So Kenyon, I'm just going to sort of start with what you said because I thought it was so. Yeah, there are lots of technical ways in which we can enforce more rigorous accountability on our own systems, and lots of tools, and you named a number of them, and there's others, and lots of tools to do that with. And one of the questions I don't know the answer to is, are we just at a threshold we're going to pass through in which there are enough safety mechanisms, and once we, the profession, if it's health sciences, health and life sciences, or the world at large, or the tech profession, once we pass through that, then we'll know, and we all know how to drive on the roads and how to lay down roads, and we know what a highway is. We don't have to learn that anymore. Or is it the kind of thing where this type of infrastructure will always be evolving? It's like cybersecurity, where you can never quite catch up with the dangers because the dangers are always moving of you. And I don't know which it's going to be, but
I don't know either, but I think it's probably the latter. I mean, it's going to always evolve, right? I mean, with every advancement, with ChatGPT, there's also Worm GPT out there, right? And so Worm GPT has gotten very, very good about making fake medical records, right? And so if you're making a fake medical record, and then it makes it easier to commit fraud using your Worm GPT generative AI, and it's almost as good as ChatGPT. How do you guard against that? And then it'll take an evolving set of tools or changes to the process. Like the current processes, which are accepting medical records that look like medical records, might have to change because they're so good at making fake medical records now. Right. So I don't know, but I think the point is I do think it's going to have to evolve. And like our transportation safety network has evolved over the years, but there's still lots of dangers out there, and so we continue to change things.
That's why I think you should really consider writing the fact you will never end, like James Bond.
Well, it's very, very flattering.
No, it's true. It's true. The subject is very interesting, and the way you write it, the way you talk, is very exciting. And I can help you with a lot of stories.
I have your card. I would be a little careful about that. But
should we see if there are any questions from the folks who are on the? Okay, great. Good to see you, Mark.
Best if you just open your mic because we're not seeing anyone asking with hands raised or chats.
Okay.
Oops, Leslie.
Okay. Well, any further questions here in the room?
No, I was just saying on his earlier comment about patient safety, I think there's so much polypharmacy in the U.S., especially with older adults, that you don't really have. It's almost impossible to have randomized control trials of all the different combinations of these drugs. So the ability to apply is really powerful for large neural networks and other methods to get that data. That now that we can connect data, and I think it's also important to continue to figure out to evolve the policy. Like typically, you can now search across other change, but you still need individual research authorization for certain queries. So if we can sort of evolve the policy to allow for patient safety, large scale research on QHITs, I think that would be one of these evolving benefits to them.
Sure. Well, and one of the topics we deliberately chose to not go into today was, the models to do what you're describing. There's a centralized model, which was it's used in the All of Us, the NIH program, as well as the separately a larger data collection with COVID, the N3C consortium, which also used a centralized approach. There are also semi or completely distributed models like the FDA Sentinel program, where there's over 20 data partners who each have informed data sets, and you send a query to the data ensuring the privacy and avoiding the dangers of centralizing data. So I think when you start to think about these things and start to think about doing machine learning both locally and in a distributed way to find out the local trends, to do that work earlier, because certain organizations are going to be able to learn things faster. It's a very, very, very exciting world. And I'm currently working with a company that's working with some of the major payers, the major providers, VAs involved, Kaiser Permanente's involved, and they all see that there's a need to be able to do decentralization to improve privacy protection, doing granular privacy protection, enhancing identity management, consent management. We talked about consent being a huge issue. So when you do get the slides, and you'll see that those 10 issues, you'll see all those technologies, and those are things that are active funded projects with Microsoft, with Oracle, with the entities I provided. So it's that whole world of real world evidence gets very, very exciting now that everyone's on electronic platforms.
Now, ARPA-H is first.
Hey, Joe, if I can come off mute on here. So you just mentioned something that's really cogent. So the General Services Administration has a test lab. That's very important government-wide, and we have to think government here, or at least that's my approach. And from the government-wide, the person who runs this test lab, which is mostly about cloud, and they're not trying to create anything out of this lab. They're trying to test and to see if something can be government compliant. They are looking at blockchains, and they're looking at blockchain for identity. That should guide us and tell us a lot. Then if you see in the chat what came out of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau just today, what they're trying to do with data, that also folds in, because anything you can do with PII, you can do with PHI. But the last thing I wanted to add is that we can talk machine learning, but we also have to go back to artificial intelligence. We have to go back to what NASA does and what the algorithms from the 1950s and 60s were that got our space program going, which was to do AI mathematical algorithms that limited sorry, I hear babies crying, but anyway, those algorithms were about reducing risk, making narrowing the possibilities. And the AI that does that for medicine is very helpful, but nothing replaces the doctor, nothing replaces human judgment today. And then somebody else spoke about that. Human beings can judge. Machines are simply right now binomial. We haven't gotten to a quantum machine yet. I don't care what people say. Those are my thoughts, and I really wanted to add those in there. It was a great talk today. Fantastic research that's shared throughout this book, supporting what's behind culture, what's behind a lot of the numbers that are behind what can be. So thank you for inviting me over.
Great. Thank you, Sandy. Art, can I let you have the last word today?
So much is going on that any sort of, this is a pretty casual conversation in that it was, or a high level conversation. And it makes it clear how much is going on in a very fine-grained way, in a granular, in the weeds way, that is semi-aware of each other. And yet that where each of these different projects and efforts need to be aware of each other. what I'm driving at when I say that is that the efforts to, I don't think that would have been the case 2 years ago. I think when Juliette and I started working on the book, which was about 1.5 years ago, we felt we were in an environment where people didn't think about the risks along with the benefits, and where they didn't really know what to think about the benefits. Now, except for, specialists in the field, and the specialists in the field were kind of in the weeds about, with some exceptions, but now it's public discourse. It's not the matrix, it's not HAL, it's a series of tools that are very difficult to guide correctly and that are already essential. We're not going to go back to a world where AI doesn't do some of these tasks. We're not going to go, and in every plausible future, AI is working. People are using AI to autonomously, independently generate more and more applications of AI, with millions of people who wouldn't have even considered themselves programmers or coders now going into areas where they are, they're not looking at things the way traditional coders would have. And we haven't really seen that play out yet. We're going to see that. Right now, we're in the phase where the leaders of the field have put forth open source platforms and invited others to make sense of them and use them. And that's still happening. We're still in the very first stages of that type of thing. So in that sense, the future challenges are the future challenges of people. And imagine. Every time I try to come up with some real innate technical aspect to it that yields everything, it always comes back to people. And I think one possible way to evolve is to realize that, our ways, we need to be more sophisticated in how we manage ourselves and manage others, because at the end of the day, that's going to be how we manage AI.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Discussion.